Welcome to this video on the top 10 vampires of Clan Toreador from the tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade. The Toreador. What can I say about these blatant Anne Rice-inspired beautiful people? They are a clan devoted to the aesthetic, the fruit of the human soul, but they are notorious for an astonishing level of vindictiveness and petty cruelty. Despite the gangrel reputation for recklessly siring progeny, the Toreador have created and abandoned numerous progeny who failed to live up to their sires' expectations. But without further ado, since this will be a little bit longer than usual, here are the top 10 vampires of Clan Toreador. Number 10. Helena. The Jyhad is really a game of elders, and there is perhaps no feud between elders quite as long-running, well-documented, world-spanning, and bitterly personal as the war between Helena and the Bruja Menelae. Menelae was discussed in the top 10 vampires of Clan Bruja. Now for the other side, Helena. Helena was born in the 13th century BC in Greece, a princess of the city-state of Argos. Even as a mortal, she was regarded as the most beautiful woman in the world. Her father, then king, doted on her, and the people of Argos loved her. Life was good, but her idyllic life came to an end when the Toreador Minos came to Argos. Minos, a child of the Toreador antediluvian. To Helena, he was a hideous old man who only came to the palace at night. She was shocked when her father, glassy-eyed and vacant, told her that she was to marry Minos and become his queen. With a single handmaiden, Helena fled from Argos in disguise, racing down the Aegean coast until both collapsed from exhaustion inside of a sea cave. When Helena woke, it was dawn, and there was a man standing over her. Fear seized her heart as she believed Minos had found her, but as her eyes cleared, she saw the most beautiful man she had ever laid eyes on. The man introduced himself as Prius, Prince of Troy, and offered her refuge in his father's house. For 10 years, Helena lived happily in Troy with Prius, but Minos would not be denied what he believed was his. He came to Troy to reclaim his wife. Helena's secret fear that Minos was not entirely human bloomed into horror as he revealed himself as a vampire, tearing through the walls with his bare hands and swatting aside Prius's brothers like flies. Minos hurled Prius bodily through a wall before seizing Helena and carrying her back to Argos. Minos had decided to embrace Helena long before, but now he wanted to punish her for making him wait a decade, but it would be in a way that he would enjoy. He chained Helena to her father's bed and visited her nightly, drinking her blood, but only slightly more than her body could replace. In other words, he slowly dehydrated her to death over a period of months. On the last night of this torment, Minos drained her to the point of death, then gave her a bit of his own blood. Before the embrace changed her fully, Minos locked her in a room with her beloved father. As Minos waited outside, hunger and frenzy overwhelmed Helena, and she tore into her father's neck, drinking the old king dry. The screams of anguish as Helena's madness subsided, and she was alone with her father, her first victim, were better than anything Minos could have wanted. Helena, her will broken, crowned Minos as king of Argos with her own hand, and even placed her father's crown on Minos' head. Minos reinforced his control of Helena through the generous use of dominate and blood bond. For 13 years, Helena sought a way to free herself from Minos and take revenge for her father and Prius. In time, Minos trusted his unwilling wife enough to allow her to leave the city, confident that he could summon her back. She traveled to Delphi to consult with an oracle on how to destroy Minos. The oracle told the queen that if she drank Minos dry of his blood, it would destroy him and give her his power, but if she did, her soul would be lost forever. After 13 years as Minos' queen, a force of warriors marched on the gates of Argos in the early hours of the morning, led by Prius. He surprised Minos as the king was preparing to go into torpor for the day, and drove the shaft of his wooden spear through Minos' heart. Helena seized the opportunity and dug her fangs into Minos' throat, drinking his life's blood. As Minos collapsed into dust, Helena felt a surge of power course through her veins like lightning. Helena and Prius were reunited, though both were changed, she by the embrace, and he by time. Helena offered to make Prius a vampire, but he refused. Helena considered this and offered him another way. If he drank her blood, he could become immortal, but not accursed as she was, and ever at her side. Prius accepted this, and became Helena's first Guil. They traveled the ancient world together, eventually reaching Carthage. Helena made her haven there as the Bruja raised the city up to its zenith. As the Ventru and Malkavians of Rome loosed the legions upon Carthage, Helena fought for the city at first, but soon realized that Carthage was doomed. She made an offer to the Roman Ventru, information in exchange for safety. The Roman Ventru eagerly accepted, and even threw in a domain for her as a reward for her treachery, the town of Pompeii. The Ventru destroyed Carthage and salted the earth, and Helena believed that she was safe. Unfortunately, the Bruja Menelae was not in Carthage at the time of its destruction. When he returned, he swore vengeance on those who had betrayed the Bruja's dream, and Helena was at the top of his list. Using thaumaturgy, he loosed a spirit of fire from within Mount Vesuvius to attack Helena, but quickly lost control of the spirit, resulting in the destruction of the town and its people. Helena only escaped thanks to the quick thinking of Prius. Helena journeyed to Egypt to lick her wounds and then plot her own revenge. And so began a 13th century long dance of death between two Methuselahs, with neither being able to gain the upper hand on the other, pulling in pawns and puppets both mortal and vampire alike. Finally, Helena managed to corner Menelae in Spain and wounded the Bruja. Only the coming of the sun prevented Helena from finishing off her rival, though she hoped that the day would do that for her. The next night, she found no sign of Menelae, though she was not foolish enough to assume that he had gone to final death. But she was thankful for his disappearance because she had another problem to address. The thirst of ages had seized her. The blood of mortals no longer sustained her, only the blood of other vampires. It was during this brief interlude of a few centuries that Helena sired many of her European progeny. Then she picked up the scent of Menelae again, far across the ocean in the recently discovered New World. She arranged for an expedition led by Hernan Cortez to sail across the world and resume the chase. Helena, along with her brood, assisted Cortez in destroying the Aztecs, then moved on to the Mayans, but still found no sign of Menelae. Menelae was at last found among the Incans, and Helena threw in with Francisco Pizarro. But the wily Bruja managed to escape from Helena yet again, and hid himself among the native tribes of North America, first the Pueblos, then the Blackhawks. At Fort Dearborn, the two Methuselahs met in person for the first time in nearly 7 centuries. Amidst the chaos of the Battle of Fort Dearborn in 1820, they clashed, each dealing the other wounds that would have killed a lesser vampire, but ultimately, both sank into torpor before either could be destroyed. Prius carried Helena back to the safety of the fort where she lay in torpor. Menelae disappeared with the Blackhawks. Their battle continued as they both lay in torpor, however, using the powerful disciplines to influence mortals living above their resting places. In 1999, Helena arose from torpor in the basement of Chicago's notorious Succubus Club. While Helena slept, Prius arranged for the construction of the club and moved Helena's body there so she would be safe. She immediately summoned her child Maria to her and drained her dry, then began seeking the location of Menelae's haven. If she could kill him before he rose from torpor, she would win. But in 1993, Menelae nearly succeeded in destroying Helena during the War of Chicago, when his lupine allies attacked the city. Their first stop was the Succubus Club. Helena survived the attack, but her dear Prius died on the claws of the lupines. Later, her pawn, Prince Lodin, was also killed. Since then, she has taken over the Succubus Club, disguised as a neonate Toreador named Portia. Number 9. Michael. Utopian delusions are usually the domain of the Bruja. See Carthage, the Soviet Union, and the Anarch Free States. But when the Toreador get in on the game of heaven on earth, they swing for the fences. Enter the Toreador Methuselah, Michael, or Mikhail, or Bester, as you prefer, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the architect of the dream. Mikhail was born in 2171 BC in the city of Ebla in what is modern Syria. At a young age, Mikhail was appointed the king's scribe. He later came to the attention of Arakel, the Toreador antediluvian, who embraced him in 2149 BC at the age of 22. For 50 years, Mikhail was worshipped in Ebla as a god. He took a girl named Marie as his ghoul and lover at the time. The Akkadians, possibly bolstered by the power of an Archduke of Hell, destroyed Ebla, and Mikhail fled from the city. To conceal himself from the rampaging Akkadians and their vampire minions, Mikhail renamed himself Beshter and wandered the world, observing mortal civilizations for over a millennium. In 550 BC, Beshter arrived at the Cappadocian colony of Byzantium and stayed for a year. Something about the idyllic coastal colony captivated the now elder Toreador, but he decided to move on to the barbaric west and the Seven Hills of Rome. Beshter, already one of the most powerful vampires to dwell in Rome, cultivated Rome much like a gardener, but his interest lay in art rather than politics, which he was content to leave to the Ventru and Malkavians. And speaking of the Ventru, one of them, a Gallic warlord who converted to the Roman way of life, Antonius, became the friend and later lover of Michael in 58 BC. But Beshter was ever prone to wandering. In 85 AD, during one of his trips to North Africa, he encountered something that would change his worldview forever: the Christian Church. Something about the young faith, with its tales of suffering, sacrifice, and eventually paradise, touched his withered soul, and he converted, even accepting baptism. As he emerged from the water, he adopted a new name that was also familiar. Beshter became Michael, unusually similar to his birth name, Mikhail. His choice was not motivated by simple piety. Michael was the most powerful of God's archangels, and the vampire Michael never cast off his need to be revered, or even worshipped. Another of his journeys brought him the third piece of his Holy Trinity, the Cypriot Tzimisce, known as the Draken. Like Michael and Antonius, the Tzimisce was a child of his clan's antediluvian. The Draken loved Michael for his passion and perfection, and Michael loved the Draken for his obsession with truth and metamorphosis. Michael and the Draken returned to Rome, and the Trinity was complete: Michael, Antonius, and the Draken. Michael would pick up and leave Rome several more times, leaving his Roman affairs and herd in the hands of his lovers. In 312 AD, the Roman general Constantine defeated the usurper Maxentius outside of the city, witnessing the sign of his victory written in the sky with the famous words, "In hoc signo vinces," "By this sign you shall conquer." Michael wept tears of blood as the battle raged. In Constantine, he saw the ideal ruler, divine and predatory, devout conqueror, a man ushered to his throne by the very hand of God. The Roman Ventru and Malkavians believed that Constantine was Michael's pawn and sought to oppose him, but when Constantine defeated Licinius, his rule was assured, and the vampire lords relented. Michael knew that the time to forge his dream had come. As Constantine left Rome for Byzantium to create a new Christian capital, Michael followed him. As he departed Rome, Michael left the Roman vampires with these last words: "We leave the eternal city because its heart has long since ceased beating. It dies, and you, the lords of a once glorious city, hide in its shadows, lost in a maze of your own construction. When our kind look back to these times, to the death of yet another era, they will see your accomplishments and wonder what went wrong. But never, as you conceal yourselves, will they know who was responsible, to whom praise or condemnation should be addressed. Your deeds, both great and vile, will be lost to posterity, and all they will call you will be the incognitus." In 337 AD, Constantine died, having created a city that would last for nearly a millennium. Michael and the Trinity held a series of meetings that would be known as the First Council. Their rule was solidified when the Lasombra Magnus presented the Trinity with the body of his sire, Ectorius, held paralyzed by a stake plunged through his heart by Magnus himself. When Rome fell to the German Udacir in 476 AD, Michael convened a second council to deal with the influx of mortal and vampire refugees converging on his beloved Constantinople. It was decided that each of the Trinity would form families that would be responsible for an aspect of the dream. Michael, the father of the Trinity and the dream, would guide the dream through the churches. Antonius, the son, would guide the dream through the political spheres of government and military. The Draken, the Holy Spirit, would control the dream's philosophy through the monastic orders called the Obertus. Magnus, as a reward for his original treachery, was admitted to Michael's family as a scion, giving him the freedom to dwell within the city and sire progeny. Many Roman vampires petitioned the Trinity for entry to Constantinople. Only the brood of the Bruja Trebonius, known as the Lexer, were admitted as a scion family of Antonius. By 489 AD, Michael presented the Setite Caetal to the Trinity as a candidate for scion status under his family. Antonius, eager to please Michael, agreed. The Draken brooded but said nothing. This was the first crack in the Trinity. Despite Michael's claims of Christianity and chivalry, it pleased him to play Antonius and the Draken against each other to win his favor. The Draken grew tired of Michael's games and told him so. Michael responded by isolating and marginalizing the Draken and his followers, the Obertus, from power, and gave his favor to Antonius. The Byzantine Empire expanded during this time under the reign of the mortal emperor Justinian I. The ultimate symbol of the bond between Michael and Antonius was the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in the Byzantine Empire, and at the time, in the world. In order to stop the feuding between Antonius and the Draken, Michael presented them with gifts. The brothers Jesu and Simeon, each embodying qualities ideal to the Methuselahs. Jesu, filled with divine knowledge and wisdom, was meant for the Draken. Simeon, guided by overwhelming ambition tempered by reason and subtlety, was to be Antonius's child. But Michael's plan was foiled when Jesu embraced Simeon himself. Antonius was furious, believing that the Draken had conspired to cheat him of his prize. In retribution, Antonius ushered the Syrian iconoclast Leo III to the Byzantine throne. This was the mortal face of the Canaanite iconoclasm, promoted by Antonius against the blood-worshipping cults of the Draken. Antonius intended to promote something akin to the Masquerade in Constantinople, out of his own convictions and out of spite for the Draken. Indeed, the golden icon of Christ, destroyed by Leo III, had been modeled on the Draken's mortal face. But this not only brought Antonius into conflict with the Draken, but with Michael himself. Michael's own vanity would not permit him to be consigned to remain in the shadows forever. He wanted, no, needed, to be admired, revered, praised, worshipped, and loved. In 796 AD, Michael and the Draken met in secret with Antonius's own childer, Septima and Caius, to discuss the problem of the iconoclasm. Caius, who coveted Antonius's position as head of the family and as Michael's lover, proposed the assassination of Antonius as the only means of restoring peace. Reluctantly, Michael and the Draken agreed. Just before a cold December morning, Caius ambushed his sire and staked him, leaving the ancient Ventru to greet the sun. And with this act, the Trinity was irrevocably broken. Michael and the Draken retreated into isolation. Michael shunned Caius, even after allowing Caius to take control of Antonius's family. The Draken realized that he had loved Antonius just as much as he had hated him. Antonius's death snapped Michael out of his reverie. In the interest of restoring order, Michael assumed the Byzantine throne himself and ruled openly as Michael III. In 888 AD, the Draken left Constantinople. Michael, with one lover dead and abandoned by the other, recognized Jesu and Simeon as the legitimate heirs of the Draken's family and gave control of his own affairs to his child Petronius and his La Sombra ally Magnus. For the next 3 centuries, Michael retreated into bouts of torpor, meditation on his own failures, and delusions of divinity. In 1204 AD, as the city he fathered, Constantinople, burned above him, he gathered around him the 3 symbols of his 3 greatest failures. The resurrected Mari, now the Bali vampire, Mary the Black, the symbol of his failure to protect those who worshipped him in Ebla. The sycophantic La Sombra, Peter the Humble, the symbol of the weakness and strife he fostered and allowed to corrupt the dream by playing his lovers against each other and never allowing either to rise above him. And finally, a vampire in service to the Archbishop of Nod, Narcissus, whose hatred Michael had unwittingly fostered through failure to recognize Narcissus' talent and dedication. These were the 3 nails of Michael's cross. Michael gathered these sins together to destroy him. He was not simply a part of the Trinity. He was the Trinity itself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He had been father to the dream. He had to become the Son and sacrifice himself for the good of his world, so he believed, and so that his spirit could be freed to ascend as the Holy Spirit. It is generally believed that Michael met his end, willingly, at the fangs of Mary the Black, in his haven beneath the Hagia Sophia. In life, he had manipulated his appearance to look like an angel, climbed down from a stained glass window, a being of light and perfection, exploded with color. In death, Michael became a saint and martyr to the vampires who followed the road of heaven and the road of chivalry. His vanity, narcissism, pride, and madness washed away as he became the icon he had always desired to be. Number 8. Rafael de Corazon. Depending on who you ask, Rafael de Corazon is the savior of Cain's children, or the penultimate poser Toreador who has inflicted his cowardly worldview on the whole of his kind. Rafael was born in 1154 AD in Spain, while the country was still divided between Christian and Muslim rule. The Bishop of Navarra took notice of the cherubic peasant boy and added Rafael to his collection of altar boys. Rafael was the bishop's favorite, but he tried to stay out of the way of his jealous rivals while using the bishop's power to strike back at them. But just as soon as he was getting a handle on wielding covert power, he started to get a little too old for the bishop's taste. Newer, younger altar boys were entering the cathedral. Rafael's rivals prepared for his ultimate downfall. Using the last of his influence on the bishop, Rafael begged to be put in the seminary, rather than shuffled off to the monastery with the rest of the discarded altar boys. Despite having little talent for being a priest, Rafael protected himself by maintaining a low profile while seeking prestige through the control of important church projects. He missed out on the most important projects like cathedral construction, but landed lesser assignments like cathedral mosaics and the illumination of manuscripts. Rafael claimed the best illuminations created by the monks under his supervision as his own. When they protested, he warned them against questioning his authority. But the bishop ignored the works produced by Rafael's monks, and he felt his status begin to fall again. As before, he took a gamble and ordered his monks to illuminate some more sexually explicit scenes inspired from the Bible, like Adam knowing Eve, the biblical wording for a man and a woman doing the sort of thing you see on Pornhub. The bishop greatly approved of the new manuscript, and Rafael's status rose in the cathedral. Today's lesson: sex always sells. Meanwhile, the Bishop of Navarre made plans to convert a certain reclusive noblewoman to Christianity, a woman with a taste for art. That woman's name was Callisti y Castillo. Many of the bishop's priests objected, decrying Callisti for the rumors that surrounded her. She was an immortal pagan witch, kept alive through ritualistic blood drinking, one of the spawn of Satan. Other priests claimed that, even if true, Callisti's pagan ways were a lesser threat than the warriors of the Almohad Caliphate, poised over them like a cat over a mouse. The bishop's priests scurried about the cathedral to make every detail perfect for Callisti's nocturnal visit, while others prayed for their immortal souls against the wiles of the demonic harlot about to come amongst them. At the appointed hour, midnight, Callisti Castillo swept into the cathedral, flanked by a group of hard-eyed warriors, and trailed by an entourage of handsome male attendants. She was dark majesty and immoral sensuality. The priests and monks, even those who had opposed her coming, crept out of their cells to catch a glimpse of the witch. As the bishop pressed the priests to button up their mouths and present the cathedral's gifts to her, Rafael caught sight of Callisti, and his heart was filled with a lust for the imperious, scandalous woman. Meanwhile, she glanced at the mosaics, the illuminated Bible, and tossed them aside as uninteresting and uninspired. In the confusion of her rejection, Rafael approached Callisti with his monk's manuscripts, depicting nude images of Adam and Eve having sex after being cast out of the Garden of Eden. She praised the work and agreed to the conversion to Christianity by the startled and confused bishop. She even made a sizable donation to the Reconquista's efforts and even offered the use of her own fortresses. A vampire's generosity always comes at a price. Callisti's price was Rafael. The bishop refused the unusual and unseemly request. In the days after, Rafael grew noticeably pale and lethargic. Unbeknownst to the bishop or Rafael, Callisti paid the newest object of her interest nightly visits in his cell and fed from him, just enough to weaken him, but not enough to kill him. The bishop changed his mind and sent Rafael to his new mistress, Callisti, Methuselah of Clan Toreador. In 1182, Callisti embraced Rafael, then demanded that he produce more erotic illuminations for her. But Rafael's lack of artistic talent soon revealed itself, and Rafael was forced to confess that he had claimed the work of others as his own. Callisti flew into a rage and nearly destroyed Rafael. He managed to save his unlife by a novel argument. His art was his ability to deceive and create the image of himself in the eyes of others, a talent rarer than merely putting brushes to paper. Callisti was so amused by Rafael's appeal for mercy that she spared him, though he would be the lowest and least of the flock of attractive and talented vampires that Callisti had gathered around her over the years. Rafael, true to form, receded into the background, made his plans, and bided his time. By the time of the 14th century, Callisti had grown bored with Christian art and the intra-clan politics of the Toreador. She abandoned Europe in favor of India, where she believed that more inspired erotica could be found. Rafael volunteered to run her European affairs in her absence, and she half-heartedly assented, more concerned with reaching India as quickly as possible. As soon as Callisti sailed over the horizon, Rafael began exploiting his new authority. In his departed mistress's name, he made alliances and created numerous progeny for his own benefit. Rather than be an artist himself, he became a patron of artists. He used his position to embarrass and alienate his rivals within the clan. Rafael received his mistress's invitation to the Convention of Thorns and traveled to England in her place, to determine the new shape of vampire affairs as the Inquisition raged and the anarchs were brought to heel. There were competing calls amongst the elders for a war, a purge rather, against mortals and anarchs alike, to break them, reduce their numbers to a more manageable level, and to lord over them with an iron fist. Others proposed using the anarchs to fight the Inquisition. Rafael rose to the podium and read the sixth tradition of Cain to them. Thou shalt not reveal thy true nature to those not of the blood. The assembly was as silent as a grave when he read the sixth tradition again and again, until the elders howled in outrage and called for him to be dragged from the assembly. As the guards moved for him, Rafael shouted that the elders themselves were to blame for the current situation by living openly amongst mortals, that by violating the sixth tradition so flagrantly, they had brought devastation on themselves. Mortals were too numerous to be lorded over, and that they would always try to destroy vampires if they were aware of them. He proposed that vampires actively conceal their true nature from mortals. His pleas managed to break through to the elders of the Ventru and the Tremere. He turned the calls for war against mortals to a war for the minds of mortals. And so, the Masquerade was born. The official policy of the newly formed Camarilla was that the Masquerade was to be enforced on pain of final death. Vampires had to cover their tracks. Mortal agents changed the intellectual landscape from belief in the supernatural to cynicism and skepticism. Any talk of vampires was to be met with scoffing and ridicule. The Inquisition relented and ultimately atrophied to a small, barely noticed order within the church, and Rafael was the hero of the day, elevated by virtue of his ruthlessness and calculating nature to the very heights of the Camarilla as the first Justicar of Clan Toreador. Rafael also became the most vocal proponent for crushing the anarchs, just as he once used the bishop's authority against his rival altar boys. But secretly, Rafael is terrified by the thought of Callisti returning and her reaction to his abuse of her power. Number 7. Francois Villon. Here's another child of Helena, Francois Villon, or a vampire calling himself Francois Villon, the Prince of Paris. He was born around 1200 AD, but little is known of his mortal life before he crossed paths with Helena. Supposedly, he was a linguistic scholar who dreamed about a good marriage to a noble heiress, and in a sense, he got his wish. Who could be more noble than a queen of Argos? And what could be a better inheritance than being a child of one of the oldest and most powerful members of a clan dedicated to beauty and art? True, Helena's target was, and remains, Melinda, but Francois provided her with a pleasant but momentary distraction from her endless jihad, so she rewarded him with immortality in 1230 AD. Helena instructed Francois in the art of rule, as well as the necessity of constructing a legend around oneself, because the perception of power is the next best thing to actual power. Francois was a keen pupil before his mistress left him to continue her war against Melinda. Since then, Francois has claimed to be witness to, or participant in, all manner of legendary and historical events, whether it was the slaying of the dragon by St. George, the crossing of the Alps with Hannibal Barca, or Christ's transmutation of water into wine at the wedding in Cana. The details of Francois' past are contradictory. In one version, Francois infiltrated the ruling house of Valois, where he used the royal power to shape his own masterpiece, the French language itself. Francois promoted the transition of France from the crude amalgamation of vulgar Latin and Gallic to Middle French, along with promoting French literature throughout Europe. He was a favorite of Queen Catherine de' Medici, Queen Henry's wife and patron of the arts in France. But with the fall of the House of Valois and the ascension of the House of Bourbon in the form of Henry IV, Francois took the change of noble houses as an opportunity to go on a tour of France and Europe. Francois returned in the 17th century during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, to serve as seneschal to the then Prince of Paris. In 1789, when the mortal Jacobins and the vampire furore seized France from its royal and immortal rulers alike, Francois fled Paris to the safety of Britain, leaving the prince and many other vampires to their fate. He returned to Paris during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte to rally the Toreador to his banner, declaring himself Prince of the City of Lights. In the Victorian age, Francois was rumored to have taken a Zamitzi lover. Dr. Cornelius Netchurch, perhaps a relation to Dr. Douglas Netchurch, claimed that the Zamitzi's name was Sasha. Just let that one roll around in your head for a while. The Camarilla Prince and the Sabbat's chief torturer, together. Yeah. Most sane vampires try to stay away from Sasha Vikos at all costs. But this Toreador makes kissy faces at him, her, it. Francois has balls, if nothing else. Hopefully Vikos didn't fleshcraft him to the back of his own head after the breakup. Anyway, Francois has demonstrated amply since his ascension that he is the master of the game, as Helena taught him to be. No vampire in Paris, or France for that matter, has the will to challenge him, and he has beaten back the challenges of vampires older and more powerful than himself through the ruthless gathering and deployment of information, favors, and blackmail. To the Camarilla at large, he is the very model of what a prince should be. In the modern nights, he holds court in the first arrondissement of Paris, near the Louvre, adjudicating kindred law and directing mortal culture with equal relish. His preferred pastime is dictating the course of the Parisian fashion industry. This gives him a nearly endless supply of models to feed his appetite for beauty, as well as blood. Number 6. Christopher Houghton. If you played Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, you are aware of the adorable little slap fight between Sebastian Lacroix, Ming Zhao, Nines Rodriguez, and Andre to determine who would rule Los Angeles. It was all so silly and unnecessary. Los Angeles has only ever had one master, and that is the same vampire who created it, the Toreador, Christopher Houghton. Christopher Houghton was born in a London slum in 1669. When he was 10, Christopher's angelic looks drew the attention of a well-to-do artist named John White, who scooped the boy out of the gutter. After some grooming and training, White used Houghton as a companion and model, among other things. But while White did use Houghton, Houghton also used White, draining the older man of resources so that Christopher could make his own foray into the London world of art. It was only natural that the height of the art world be occupied by the Toreador. Enter Sir Matthew Lubbock of Clan Toreador, elder and unwilling guest of London's eternal prince, Mithras of Clan Ventru. Lubbock was a hostage per an agreement between a rebel Toreador faction in Edinburgh and Mithras. Houghton's good looks set Lubbock's dead, ephebophilic heart all aflutter, and Houghton had all of the superficial charms required to string the old vampire along. Houghton abandoned White for Lubbock. White committed suicide a month later. White's death would be one of the few times Christopher Houghton ever felt something normal people might consider remorse. But it quickly passed. 3 years later, when Christopher was 13, Lubbock was unable to contain his ardor and embraced the youthful object of his obsession. In death, Christopher became the ultimate poser, attaching himself to the latest artists and crazes in London, all without ever producing a single work of his own, skating by on his charm and good looks as he had in life. In 1746, after the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites supported by the Toreador, Sir Matthew decided that it would be a good time to get out of London before Mithras decided to punish the Toreador closest at hand, specifically him. Sir Matthew and Christopher boarded a ship bound for Boston, Massachusetts, and there sat out the American Revolution. By the 1820s, Sir Matthew, tiring of Christopher's endless leeching off of the art world, ordered him to create something, anything, worthy of the respect of the Toreador of the city. Christopher was thrilled that he finally had the opportunity to flex his artistic muscle and went to work on a painting he titled The Gates of Heaven. In September, after 9 months of hard work, he was ready to unveil his masterpiece. Before a gathering of New England's most prominent Toreador, Christopher tore down the cover of his painting so that all of the clan could finally appreciate his genius. He was met with silence, then a giggle. Then the giggle turned into more giggling. Then the salon broke out into uproarious, deafening laughter. His painting, his work had been recognized, but as uninspired schlock, trash of the worst sort, produced by the worst sort of poser that the clan is often accused of harboring. Sir Matthew was enraged. His standing in the clan had been irreparably damaged. He seized Christopher and ordered him to leave his haven and Boston and never return. Christopher, near frenzied, ordered the only Guil loyal to him named Jack Turpin to load him aboard a ship and take him to Asia, where he might find someone who appreciated his sense of aesthetic. Most likely he would have been promptly dismembered by the Primogen within a week. But thankfully for Christopher, his ship, the Danube, never made it to Asia. On Christmas Day, 1828, the Danube wrecked in San Pedro Bay due to an unexpected storm. The 28 survivors, including Turpin, were taken in by the local hacendado, Don Sebastian Juan Dominguez. Among the cargo recovered was a long, coffin-shaped box. Oh hell, they fished the Toreador out of the bay rather than letting his coffin sink. When Christopher arose and realized that he was not in Cathay, he went into another frenzy, killing Turpin, and then the entire Dominguez household save for Don Sebastian, who had the good sense to hide himself in the chicken coop. When Christopher returned to his senses, he tracked down the cowering Don Sebastian, explained the situation, and made the Don his Guil. Christopher would go on to feed from the local Indian tribes. After some consideration, Christopher decided that he would make a city for an unappreciated artist like himself, a Carthage after his own image, where mortals and vampires would look to him for inspiration and approval. His first step was the dismantling of California's mission system. The priests were looking suspiciously at Don Sebastian, who seemed much healthier than a man his age ought to have been, not to mention Christopher's increasingly sloppy feeding habits too close to the Don's hacienda. By 1844, with Don Sebastian at Governor Figueroa's ear, the missions were seized and sold off to the rancheros, and the priests were safely confined to their churches, where they belong. Some commentators note that cities often take on the character of the vampires who infest them, and Christopher Houghton, for the first time in 2 centuries, had no authority figure to tell him what to do, so he indulged in every vice and debauchery he could think of. Likewise, Los Angeles, rather than becoming a new Carthage, was more akin to a new Sodom. Settlers, failed prospectors, thieves, rapists, murderers, whores, drunks, gamblers, and more gathered around Los Angeles like flies around a week-old corpse. Don Sebastian's once pristine rancho became an avatar for Christopher's homicidal indulgences. It was only the high mortality rate among the kind that concealed Christopher's activities from the Camarilla as well as the Inquisition. By 1870, Christopher finally got bored with rebelliousness. He realized that he was wasting his time indulging when he should be building. But unlike in Boston, he would never again expose himself to the scorn of others. He would be the king of California, but he would be an invisible king. On Christmas Day, 42 years after their first meeting, Christopher finally embraced Don Sebastian and named him Prince of Los Angeles. Christopher commanded Don Sebastian to pull down the gambling dens, brothels, and saloons, and replace them with dance studios, bookstores, and libraries. Christopher, through bribery, threats, and domination, got the Big Four railroads to run lines through Los Angeles, and then made it extremely cheap to move west. This, combined with an advertising campaign depicting California as the new promised land, led to a population boom. New communities went up. To assure the growth of the city, Christopher used straw purchases to buy up property in the Owens Valley north of LA, and then created a fake water shortage to manipulate the people into voting for funds to build an aqueduct from Owens Valley into the San Fernando Valley. So the independent cities around LA submitted to the control of Los Angeles in exchange for a continued supply of water. In 1909, Christopher had found a medium worthy of his artistic vision: film. When the directors came to California for location shoots, he persuaded them through Presence and Dominate to stay in Los Angeles and set up shop in Hollywood. He generously supported the establishment of big film studios, and later, the studio system. A late-night meeting with Christopher was all it took for big-time talent to be persuaded to put down roots in Hollywood and sign contracts that effectively made them the property of the studios. For the first 30 years of the Hollywood film industry's existence, Christopher micromanaged everything, from budgets to actors to costumes to final edits, leaving Don Sebastian to rule Los Angeles. The actors Christopher was attracted to quickly became big stars, including Clark Gable. Christopher withdrew into the background completely after the Anarch Revolt of 1944, his last act being a reenactment of the slaughter of the Dominguez Hacienda from over a century before. Only this time, Don Sebastian did not survive Christopher's fury. The Anarch Salvador Garcia found Don Sebastian's body mangled beyond recognition and his head deposited in a bathroom wastebasket. The only witness to the slaughter was a Malkavian babbling about a golden-haired demon. Christopher spends most of his time in his ruined mansion in the Hollywood Hills. Despite being of the fifth generation and demonstrably more powerful than just about everyone in Los Angeles, aside from a certain humble cab driver, he still fears the day that the powerful Sir Matthew decides to take revenge for the humiliation Christopher caused him so long ago. This is the primary reason he has not swept the Anarchs, the Camarilla, the Sabbat, and the Quai out of his city completely. So he flutters from interest to interest like an especially lethal butterfly, craving immediate gratification and recognition of his brilliance, which will never come. Number 5. Madame Guil. The best term to describe one of the most fearsome Justicars of the Camarilla, Madame Guil, the Mistress of Tears, is that she is a necessary evil. She is both very necessary and very, very evil. The lengths to which he has gone to root out and punish traitors in the Camarilla are the subject of terrible tales. For some vampires, walking out into the sun is preferable to facing Madame Guil's unique brand of justice. The woman who would become Madame Guil was born in 1563 in a peasant village in France. Despite growing up hungry and impoverished, by the time she was 16, her beauty was such that painters and sculptors would give up their hands for the chance to capture it on canvas or in stone. Her betrothed was a handsome Wainwright named Luke, who she had met and flirted with at the previous year's spring fair. But she had also drawn the eyes of the dead as well as the living. The Toreador, Baron Philippe Volgier, a child of Helena, saw her dancing at the harvest festival and felt his cold blood stir in his withered heart, and was overcome with the need to possess her. Volgier summoned the woman to his estate on a pretense and drained her of her blood, then embraced her. But the embrace sapped her of vivacity along with vitality. This did not trouble the Baron overmuch, as he had intended to dispose of his new toy when he tired of her. But it was a great surprise to him when he awoke from torpor one evening to find a broken wooden stake poking obscenely from his chest, and the heat rising as his castle burned down around him. Baron Volgier and his peasant girl are largely forgotten in the annals of vampire history. During the Renaissance, a new kindred swept into the French scene by storm. Mademoiselle Guil, a charming and graceful, if unpolished young Toreador, who quickly gathered a throng of admirers and followers around her, mortal and vampire alike. Despite her popularity, she remained on the outskirts of Camarilla society, always selective as to who she allowed within her circle. It was hardly noticed that one or two of her vampire admirers disappeared from time to time. After all, the roads are dangerous, even for vampires, and one took one's chances in being ambushed by a roving pack of Sabbat or lupines if one went out alone, or was last seen in the company of Mademoiselle Guil. In the early 17th century, fate brought Guil's first love, Luc, back to her. At a courtier's ball, she saw him again, from across a room, dressed appropriately for the occasion, but it was him. At first, Guil thought it might be Luc's specter, or perhaps a descendant of his. She nearly fainted, but when their eyes met, she knew it was him. When they were finally alone, Luc told Guil what had happened to him. When she didn't return from Baron Volgier's castle, he took to the road, hoping to outrun his grief. One night he was attacked by a band of anarchs who preferred to exist as outlaws from both the Camarilla and the Sabbat, leading unlives as robbers and murderers. The anarchs wanted Luc for a meal and perhaps a little sport, but Luc fought the anarchs without care for pain or death. His fight so impressed the anarchs that they embraced him into their merry little band. But when the band was wiped out by true Sabbat, Luc was again alone, much as Guil herself had been, always on the periphery of vampire society. Guil and Luc laughed as they had when they were mortal and in love. They drank each other's blood, and Guil confided in Luc that she had developed a taste for the amaranth, the forbidden practice of drinking other vampires to final death. They made a vow to rid the world of the monsters who had stolen their innocence and their mortality from them. For a time, Guil and Luc were the most prolific diablerists in France, but their spree of murder came to an end when they failed to diablerize a child of Francois Villon, the Prince of Paris. Luc took the prince's fury and the subsequent blood hunt on himself, and told Guil to escape. Believing Luc to be lost to her again, Guil vanished. She re-emerged in the thick of the French Revolution among the Furores, the anarchs of France, subjecting mortal and vampire alike to the tender mercies of the national razor, the people's barber, the guillotine. Guil herself was nearly executed in the chaos and escaped only by the sacrifice of several pawns of hers. Guil shed her name again and reinvented herself, out of the blackest irony, as Madame Guil, and placed herself in the service of the vampire she hated as much as she once hated Baron Volgier, Prince Francois Villon. Villon had never actually seen Guil, nor had any of his retainers who survived her diablerous spree with Luc or the French Revolution. She quickly made herself indispensable to the prince, channeling her rage at the Camarilla and all vampires into rooting out and destroying the Camarilla's enemies. One of the few things that could bring a smile to her beautiful and cruel face is inflicting a slow death on a vampire who believed themselves to be untouchable. But in 1996, while tracking down an unidentified Sabbat assassin, Madame Guil once again stumbled across her lost Luc, now in the employ of the Sabbat as one of their fearsome Templars, the military elite outside of the Black Hand. Indeed, it had been the Black Hand who had saved Luc's unlife while he was under Prince Francois's blood hunt, after Luc had thrown himself on the Black Hand's mercy. They vowed never again to be parted, not by the Camarilla or the Sabbat, as they drank each other's blood. Madame Guil now walks the narrowest of ledges. If her relationship with Luc were discovered, it would mean certain death for both of them, either at the hands of the Camarilla or the Sabbat. Number 4. Melinda Galbraith. The La Sombre and the Zamitzi are the clans most commonly identified as foundational to the Sabbat, and who have the most power in the sect. Yet for over 150 years, the Sabbat has been ruled by a Toreador, Melinda Galbraith, an elder in her own right, and child of the Methuselah, Helena. Galbraith was born in Spain, where she survived an outbreak of the plague that left her partially scarred. Helena, requiring a new agent and vessel, having succumbed to the thirst of ages, took Galbraith and embraced her in 1143. Galbraith dutifully followed and fed her sire during her century-long search for her hated enemy, the Bruja Menelay. When Helena discovered Menelay in the New World, Galbraith followed her sire in the expedition of Hernan Cortez to Mexico in 1519. The war between the conquistadors and the Aztecs was but one of many of the proxy wars waged throughout history between Helena and Menelay. But Galbraith fought mortals, vampires, and even mages for her sire's sake. But once the Incan Empire was crushed, Menelay fled north. Helena remained in Central America for a time, but abandoned Galbraith in Mexico City when she learned that Menelay had fled north and dwelled among the indigenous tribes of the Central Plains. Unbeknownst to Galbraith, it was not only the hatred of Menelay that caused Helena's departure. There was something older than even Helena sleeping beneath Tenochtitlan, a vampire dating back to the Second City, the torpid Bali Methuselah, known as the Shaitan. To his Aztec worshippers, he was Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. Helena fled rather than fight the demonic vampire without so much as a word to Galbraith. Soon after Helena's departure, the Sabbat arrived in Mexico, fresh from their first civil war. Galbraith, firmly entrenched in Mexico City in the absence of her sire, welcomed them and joined their ranks, hoping the Valkyrie would free her from her blood bond to Helena. For her support of the Sabbat and in recognition of her power, the Regent gave her the position of Archbishop of Mexico City and Cardinal of the Sabbat. After the Sabbat recognized Galbraith's claims to Mexico City, she was contacted by Huitzilopochtli, who offered her power and wisdom in exchange for service. She agreed and kept the Bali's body safe from the Sabbat Diablerist while he slumbered. In 1863, the regent of the Sabbat, Gorkist of Clan Tzimisce, was assassinated by suicidal Ravnos, sparking a second Sabbat civil war. By the end of the war in 1933, Galbraith, through the generous applications of blackmail and assassination, along with her position as Archbishop of Mexico City and the wise counsel of Huitzilopochtli, she emerged as the fourth regent of the Sabbat, and the first regent to be neither La Sombra nor Tzimisce, though nearly everyone believes that she is La Sombra. As to why she has allowed the misapprehension to continue, perhaps it is easier to play along with the expectations of her fellow Sabbat, or perhaps she feared that she could be identified as a child of Helena. Galbraith rose to the height of the Sabbat on the back of an assassination. It would only be appropriate that her reign would end in similar fashion. In 2000, at the height of the Palo Grande in Mexico City, on All Hallows Eve, an unknown assassin entered one of Galbraith's penthouse apartments and slew her as she prepared to attend a major ball. The only clue the killer left was an arcane symbol drawn on the wall in blood. The unlucky vampire who discovered her corpse was the fledgling Tzimisce, Zachary Sikorsky, who reacted by... well, that's a story for another day. Number 3. Mercy. Do you know how some people have nicknames that are the opposite of the word used to describe them? Like a tall guy named Shorty, or a fat guy named Slim. Well, Mercy, or Alessandra as she was known in mortal life, earned her name in much the same way. Mercy is, well, incapable of mercy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The woman who would become Mercy was born under the name Alessandra in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil around the 1870s. Alessandra was a devotee of La Regla Lucumi, or as it is more commonly known, Santeria, a combination of the Yoruba religion, Christianity, and various indigenous American practices. Alessandra is not attractive by common standard. She is squat, stocky, and conveys a brutishness in how she carries herself and speaks. Yet her Toreador sire, Dominique Santopaulo, was one of the Toreador anti-tribu who shared control of South America's religions with the La Sombra, and on that basis, they tend to pick their embraces more for their utility than for their aesthetic, unlike the prissy, effete Toreador of Europe and North America. Alessandra was taken and given the creation rites in 1899. She had difficulty reconciling her mortal faith with her new state as one of the damned. She fell away from La Regla Lucumi as she embraced the more bestial existence of a Sabbat vampire. Eventually, she filled the space in her soul by participating in La Sombra and Setite blood cults, deepening her depravity and bloodlust until she became a monster who reveled not simply in killing, but in carnage. Rio de Janeiro has an uneasy peace between the Camarilla and the Sabbat, who not only divide up the local religions, but the profits from mining operations in the region. Alessandra was not concerned with this beneficial but fragile relationship, and indulged her savagery to its fullest extent. The population of homeless children were some of her first prey. They disappeared at night, only to be found days later, ritually cut into pieces and floating in Guanabara Bay. She even satisfied her lust for violence on members of her former religion, the most notable incident being the deaths of 11 members of a Santeria church who had been tortured to death and then strung up from the rafters of their own church like sides of beef. The police never discovered the identity of the killer, but the Camarilla and Sabbat knew full well who had done the deed. It was the La Sombra who took the necessary steps to get Alessandra out of Rio before she upset the apple cart, so to speak. They would not give one of their own to the Camarilla for punishment, nor would they risk provoking the rest of the Toreador anti-tribu by having her tried or censured. The La Sombra did a very La Sombra thing to encourage her departure. They killed and drained every member of Alessandra's murderous blood cult while she was away. Alessandra took the hint and got on the first ship to Mexico City. In the world of darkness, Mexico City is the de facto capital of the Sabbat, and Alessandra fell in with a bad crowd, even by Sabbat standards. Specifically, she joined the path of Qadir. Vampire Catharists regard themselves as the aeons of Gnosticism, jailers and torturers of the human souls, placed in the world by the demiurge to ensure that no human transcends the material world. Alessandra was more interested in the torture part. She became famous for the artistic and prolonged torture she inflicted on her victims, eventually earning the name Mercy from among her fellow Catharists, thanks to her ability to extract babbling, whimpering, and shrieking pleas for mercy from those she would never give it to. But Catharists have a tendency to fall to infernalism. It was this tendency for highly ritualistic torture killings that brought Mercy to the attention of then Knight-Inquisitor Alfred Benezri, who put her on trial on suspicion of infernalism. Benezri eventually found Mercy innocent, or rather, not guilty, and the two developed a strange alliance. Benezri wanted to know more about La Regla Lucami and Mesa Blanca. Mercy wanted to join the Inquisition, and with Benezri's sponsorship, she did. Mercy's career in the Sabbat Inquisition has been short and spectacular. She has a nose for rooting out infernalists in Central and South America, given her understanding of the dominant and minor religions and her sheer doggedness in pursuing her quarry. Yet she has made few allies within the Inquisition, as senior inquisitors have accused her of recklessness and even destroying innocent Sabbat. Well, as if a Sabbat vampire could ever be described as such. The leaders of the Sabbat Inquisition are already aware of Mercy's peculiar tendencies, and when they deploy her, there is an expectation of significant and acceptable collateral damage. It was for this reason that the Inquisition sent Mercy and her pack, the Talons, to Montreal after the disappearances of Knight-Inquisitors Krieg and Alyssa Carini. Mercy uncovered the deception that former Archbishop Sangris used to escape his death, as well as the infernalism of the then respected Ductus, Pierre Belmer. Mercy went on a rampage through Montreal, arresting, interrogating, and torturing Sabbat vampires, as she believed corruption and heresy were rampant in the city. Eventually, Belmer's slave, Cairo, the former Alyssa Carini, led Mercy to the location of Belmer's pack, Les Orphelins. Mercy destroyed Les Orphelins to the last vampire, but Belmer managed to escape. In her fury, Belmer held an unsanctioned trial of Montreal's Archbishop, Carolina Velez, and others. At this point, her mentor, Alfred Benezri, testified on Archbishop Velez's behalf as part of a secret deal that led to Benezri becoming the new Archbishop of Montreal. But rather than return to Mexico City, Mercy was ordered to remain in Montreal to monitor the city for more instances of heresy. Mercy's continued presence in the city has strained relations between the now Archbishop Benezri and his former protege, along with her investigation into the Librarians' Pack, Keepers of the Litany of Blood, the official history of the Sabbat. Mercy, true to form, already believes the Librarians to be guilty, and only seeks the necessary proof to confirm her suspicions, so that she can burn the Librarians one and all, preferably on a pyre made of their own books. Number 2. Qadir al-Asmai. I enjoy stories of people who end up being victims of their own success. And since this guy has recently resurfaced in a certain video game about the vampires of New York, might as well throw him in the mix. Qadir was born in India sometime in the 18th century. His family had decided that it was in their interest to serve the British, who had added India first to their trading empire in the form of the British East India Company, and later the British Empire formally. Qadir's family, as a result of their service, lived in relative comfort. The Ventru Toreador who came to India founded a strange land, and had taken to embracing certain loyal natives to smooth over colonial efforts as emissaries. This is how Qadir came to the attention of the Toreador, Nasir Ramanathan, himself a product of this strategy. Qadir served Nasir and other Toreador for decades as a Guil, before he was granted the embrace in 1853. But 4 years later, in 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny broke out, which turned whole sections of Indian society against one another, based on caste in relation to the British East India Company. Qadir's sire and clan were firmly on the side of the company, and therefore Qadir was put in a position where he had to kill his own people in service to his new masters. He did what was expected of him, and the Sepoy Mutiny was put down in 1858. Nasir Ramanathan was pleased with Qadir's performance in the war and gave him his freedom, along with a letter of recommendation to the Prince of London, Mithras. However, Qadir found London not to his liking and left after only a decade, but he did not want to return to India. Qadir felt guilt over putting down his own people in the Sepoy Mutiny, but only because the dispute had come to bloodshed, rather than being settled with diplomacy. Before he left London, he met with a Bruja by the name of Don Cerro, who revealed that the Sepoy Mutiny had been supported by certain members of his clan. 'Cause, well, Bruja gonna Bruja. Qadir found Don Cerro to be a wise and insightful vampire, and served the Bruja as Archon before immigrating to America. Since his service to Don Cerro, Qadir al-Asmai has been a paragon of duty. The leaders of the Camarilla have recognized this and simultaneously granted him status and titles while saddling him with tasks that he finds distasteful. He has served as both sheriff and scourge to a number of princes and been quite effective in both roles, though he privately questions the ethics of the sort of justice the Camarilla calls upon him to mete out. This includes warring against Sabbat shovelheads or the execution of vampires whose only crime was criticizing a prince a little too loudly. When Qadir learned about the plans for the Camarilla to finally evict the Sabbat from New York in 1999, he volunteered, hoping that he could retire afterwards and establish his own permanent domain somewhere. His service to the Camarilla had eroded his humanity over the decades, and he wanted some time to reflect and make peace with everything he had done. But as Cardinal Polonia and his packs fled the city, the elders and Justicars approached Qadir and requested that he remain in New York as its sheriff, at least until order had been restored. Of course, when Justicars make a request, it's usually not a request at all. It's equal parts command and threat. Qadir reluctantly agreed. When Calabros resigned as prince, Qadir was shocked, but hardly surprised. The Nosferatu hadn't wanted the job in the first place, and like Qadir, had essentially been strong-armed into it. Qadir does consider Calabros to be a bit of a weakling for shirking his duty and failing to groom an appropriate successor before fleeing back into his sewer. But as Qadir despaired of his waning humanity, Don Cerro's progeny, the Bruja Archon Theo Bell, suggested that Qadir take the title of Prince of New York for himself. As prince, Qadir could uphold the ideals of the Camarilla without engaging in the bloodletting required of the sheriff's office. But Qadir's art is the execution of his duty, which he will do until he either retires or the beast finally claims his humanity. Number 1. Victoria Ash. Victoria Ash is a celebrity, not only among vampires, but mortals as well. Victoria spent the 90s as a famous singer and dancer, always perilously close to violating the Masquerade, but never actually doing so. Despite her stardom, her origins are as humble as anyone could boast. Victoria Ash was born in 1624 as Victoria de Perpignan, in a coastal town on the border of France and Spain. She was the bastard daughter of an alewife. When she was 13, she ran off with a soldier who soon abandoned her. Hungry, penniless, and without trade, she turned to the world's oldest profession to feed herself, and became a camp follower of the French army during the 30 Years' War. It was her singing voice that attracted the attention of a man named Maximilian. Publicly, Maximilian was a procurator of horseflesh. Privately, he was a procurator of the kind of flesh wealthy men used to satisfy their lust, i.e., a pimp. And secretly, he was a Toreador. Maximilian would often admire Victoria from a distance while she sang peasant songs at night to attract customers. At the age of 18, Maximilian charmed Victoria into joining his stable and put her in front of a better class of clientele than the soldiers caked in month-old dirt. Within 5 years, Victoria was the camp mistress of Louis II, Prince of Conde. Victoria was under no illusions as to the nature of her relationship with Louis. He was to be generous, she was to be entertaining, and she profited greatly from their arrangement. Maximilian was so impressed by Victoria's ability to hold Louis's interest that he made her his ghoul. Their fortunes turned when their patron, Louis, had the terrible idea to rebel against his king and nephew, Louis XIV, or more correctly, the king's mother and regent, Anne of Austria, and her advisor, Cardinal Mazarin. Beneath the fray of the wars collectively known as Les Frondes, the Toreador of France were split between royalist and noble factions. Maximilian would have died at the hands of the royalist Toreador had Victoria not distracted an attacker with a song long enough to jam a stake into his heart. She then fled with Maximilian to the Netherlands. When he recovered in 1650, Maximilian rewarded her with the embrace. They stayed a decade until 1660, when the English interregnum ended and Charles II was crowned as King of England. Victoria and Maximilian traveled to London to ingratiate themselves to the English nobility. On Victoria's advice, Maximilian mended fences with the French Toreador and tried to bring the English and French nobility together. The plan worked a bit too well. On the accession of James II as King of England, Maximilian discovered, to his sorrow, that his former rivals in France had more influence than he did, and true to type as Toreadors, they were more inclined to remember old grievances than new friendships. Maximilian met final death, and Victoria would have shared her sire's fate if she had not gambled on boarding a ship to a frontier settlement far across the ocean in the Americas known as New Amsterdam. As one of the first old-world vampires to travel to the New World, Victoria could safely hunt with little fear and put down roots. Her power grew alongside of America's, and she has enjoyed its wealth, selfishness, hypocrisy, and honesty, all in equal measure. Atlanta, Georgia has been her haven for centuries, though she did return to London for a brief time in the late 19th century. But after a quarrel with her child, Regina Blake, she returned to America and started playing politics amongst the Vampires of Atlanta. She maneuvered herself onto the city's Primogen council and was even poised to become the Prince of Atlanta before the Sabbat conquered the city in 1999. But in 1997, in an act that was the greatest near breach of the Masquerade since Bram Stoker's Dracula, Victoria released a hit single called The Unique Technique that spent a week as the #1 song in America. And that concludes the top 10 vampires of Clan Toreador. The Toreador are a lot more dangerous than most vampires and vampire players give them credit for being. They have an ability to tap into the desires of others, what drives them, what makes them tick, and what makes them afraid. Coming up next is the top 10 vampires of Clan Tremere, the Warlocks. Thank you for listening. Until next time.